Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Ramana. Let's dive deep into the Maharshi's spiritual instruction. We'll take up with dialogue number 350, dated February 6, 1937. While speaking to Mr. G. Shanmugam, a very sincere lawyer devotee, Bhagavan observed, "The Shastras say that one must serve a guru for 12 years for getting self-realization. What does the guru do? Does he hand it over to the disciple? Is not the self always realized? What does the common belief mean then? The man is always the self, and yet he does not know it. He confounds it with the non-self, that is, the body, etc. Such confusion is due to ignorance. If ignorance be wiped out, the confusion will cease to exist, and the true knowledge will be unfolded. By remaining in contact with realized sages, the man gradually loses the ignorance until its removal is complete. The eternal self is thus revealed." This is the meaning conveyed by the story of Ashtavakra and Janaka. The anecdotes differ in different books. We are not concerned with the names and the embellishments. The tattva, that is, the moral, must not be lost sight of. The disciple surrenders himself to the master. That means there is no vestige of individuality retained by the disciple. If the surrender is complete, all sense of individuality is lost, and there is thus no cause for misery. The eternal being is only happiness. That is revealed. Without understanding it aright, people think that the Guru teaches the disciple something like Tattvamasi, that you are, and that the disciple realizes, I am Brahman. In their ignorance, they conceive of Brahman as something more huge and powerful than anything else. With a limited eye, the man is so stuck up and wild. What will be the case if the same eye grows up enormous? He will be enormously ignorant and foolish. This false eye must perish. Its annihilation is the fruit of Guru Seva. Realization is eternal and is not newly brought about by the Guru. He helps in the removal of ignorance. That is all. Let's go back to the beginning of the dialogue and look at it in depth. The question revolves around getting self-realization. The Maharshi commences his instruction saying, what does the Guru do? Does he hand it over to the disciple? Is not the self always realized? If your self were an object, it could be handed over or taken away. But is the self an object, gross or subtle? If the self is not an object, it is then not to be newly acquired or newly attained, but must ever exist. What does the Guru do then? Whatever he does, it must have to do with the eternal existence. For what is eternally existent alone is real. What is objective is transitory. What is transitory is not worth seeking. He says, is not the self always realized? By the self is meant one's very existence, one's actual being. This has neither beginning nor end, but is always real. It always is just as it is. What then about realization? Realization to be true must be identical with the reality that is known. That is, the self. The self is always realized. How could the self, which is of the nature of immaculate existence, consciousness, bliss, ever entertain ignorance? The self, therefore, can never be unrealized. If you imagine yourself to be something other than the self, then that one can speak of feeling unrealized, or the reality seems to be apart from him. But it is not true, and it is the abandonment of that very false individuality, which is but a mere assumption and not real, that constitutes the realizing of the self. So what does the Guru do? Does he hand it over to the disciple? Your self is already existent. You have but to know it. Is not the self always realized? What does the common belief mean then? In other words, what is the purpose of Guru Seva? Seva means service or worship. The man is always the self, and yet he does not know it. The self should be known, but it cannot be objectively perceived or conceived. So how is it to be known? How is it that it is not known? He explains. He confounds it with the non-self, the body, etc. Such confusion is due to ignorance. If ignorance be wiped out, the confusion will cease to exist and true knowledge will be unfolded. Since the self is ever real, it need not be realized again. It has only to be known as it is. Such knowledge, too, is not objective in character. So how is it to be grasped? The knowledge to be true knowledge must be without beginning and without end, must partake of the same eternal nature. Then what is to be done? Ignorance is to be eliminated. Ignorance in the form of misidentification, confusing the self with what is not the self. As, for example, conceiving of yourself to be a body or a limited embodied being, both of which are imaginary and not the reality of the self at all. So to realize true knowledge, bring your confusion to an end. The confusion will cease to exist if the ignorance in the form of misidentification ceases. What then does this have to do with the Guru? He explains, by remaining in contact with realized sages, the man gradually loses the ignorance until the removal is complete. The eternal self is thus revealed. Loss of ignorance reveals the innate knowledge. As for sage, it is one who no longer regards himself, that is to say, as a separate individuality. His very being is the knowledge. What does he mean by remaining in contact? He just pointed out that the self is not the body, so contact cannot be physical. Cannot be limited to merely being in close physical proximity. It must mean something more, something deeper. He just said confusion, which is of the mind, is to be removed and eliminated. The contact must be something deeper than the mind. Deeper than the body, deeper than the mind. What are you? If you find the answer to that question within yourself, you will understand the being of the Guru, the being of sages, etc. Sri Bhagavan then continued his instruction, saying, this is the meaning conveyed by the story of Ashtavakra and Janaka. The anecdotes differ in different books. We are not concerned with the names and the embellishments, so I won't recount the story right now. Just said we're not concerned with that. The moral must not be lost sight of. The disciple surrenders himself to the master. What does it mean? He explains. That means there is no vestige of individuality retained by the disciple. If he loses his individuality, what will separate him from the reality, the truth of the self? If he has lost his individuality, where is the distinction between the Guru and the disciple? He's lost his individuality. What more remains to be realized? The very seed of illusion, of ignorance, is gone. Surrender means there is no vestige of individuality retained by the disciple. If the surrender is complete, all sense of individuality is lost, and there is thus no cause for misery. The eternal being is only happiness. That is revealed. Misery has bondage for its cause. Bondage has ignorance for its cause. The root of ignorance is misidentification. And the primal misidentification, the root of all of them, is the notion I, the assumption of existing as an individual entity. If that illusion is gone, there is then no cause for misery. Thus, misery is just a case of misperception of reality. If the reality be perceived correctly, truly, without the false sense of individuality, one's very being, which is the eternal, the birthless and the deathless, is happiness. Thus, Satchidananda, being, consciousness, bliss. That is revealed. Now he comments some more. Without understanding and aright. Understanding what? Misery, happiness, the master, the disciple, knowledge, ignorance, etc. Without understanding it aright, people think that the guru teaches the disciple something like Tattvamasi, and that the disciple realizes I am Brahman. When it is described in the Shastras that a guru teaches Tattvamasi, that you are, is it the words that he teaches, or is something deeper indicated? When the Shastras say the disciple realizes I am Brahman, does it mean he learns the statement, I am Brahman, or does it mean something far deeper? The real meaning of I am Brahman is mind-transcendent knowledge. The real meaning of the instruction Tattvamasi, again, is mind-transcendent knowledge. Knowledge of the self by the self. In either case, there is no separate individual who realizes this. Realization lies precisely in liberation from the individual. In their ignorance, he continues, they conceive of Brahman, retaining the ego notion. They conceive of Brahman as something more huge and powerful than anything else. With the limited eye, the man is so stuck up and wild. What will be the case if the same eye grows up enormous? He will be enormously ignorant and foolish. Now, what is the answer to it? He graciously bestows it and says, this false eye must perish. In the instruction, I am Brahman. Brahman is one's very being. It cannot be comprehended in the context of an ego. In the instruction Tattvamasi, Tvam, you, means what you really are. That has not a trace of ego in it. Without understanding this, how will one truly realize what's indicated by these Vedantic aphorisms or Mahavakyas. This false I must perish. Its annihilation is the fruit of Guru Seva. That is the purpose of service and worship, and indeed of all practice. It is to eliminate the false notion of I. Realization is eternal, and it is not newly brought about by the Guru. He helps in the removal of ignorance. That is all. If the ignorance that is superimposed upon the self is eliminated, that will suffice for self-realization. Reality will then shine forth to itself, by itself alone. That reality is the very same being as the Guru. By his grace, by his wisdom, the ignorance is removed. What remains is eternal being. February 7th, 1937. Dr. Subramanya Iyer, retired health officer of Salem, read out a passage which contained the instructions that one should know that the world is transitory, that worldly enjoyments are useless, that one should therefore turn away in disgust from them, restrain the senses, and meditate on the self to realize it. Sri Bhagavan observed, "How does one know the world to be transitory? Unless something permanent is held, the transitory nature of the world cannot be understood. Because the man is already the self, and the self is the eternal reality, his attention is drawn to it, and he is instructed to rivet his attention on the eternal reality, the self. It is easily observed that everything of the world and the world itself is of a transient nature. From what vantage point do you recognize this? Everything from subtle to gross, from the smallest thought to the entire manifested phenomenon, changes. Its changefulness is indicative of its unreality. Such is not the definition of unreal, but is indicative of it. From which vantage point do you perceive the unreal? Only from the real. It is from something that it never changes that you perceive all the change. What is that? Inquire.
So in other words, if your nature was transitory, you couldn't notice it as being, the world being transitory. But since your nature is...
That's right. Just as you notice what is objective because your nature is consciousness. If you were an object, you would not know it. The self is the eternal reality, he says, and the man is already the self. Consider what it means. The self is the eternal reality. And the man is already the self. In truth, there is no unrealized being. There is then no one who suffers, nor is there suffering. No one in bondage, nor is there bondage. You're instructed, he says, to rivet your attention on the eternal reality, the self. This is not just mental attention, having thoughts go along a particular direction for a period of time. Your attention, as it is called here, should be without interruption. Such is mind transcendent or thought transcendent meditation alone. It consists of pure knowledge, self-knowledge. The knowledge should rivet itself upon itself, for in self-knowledge there is no such differentiation as knower, knowing, and known. In self-knowledge, knower, knowing, and known are identical. They are one and the same thing. Whom is he instructing about the eternal reality, the self? Why, only the self can comprehend this. The reality reveals reality to the real. The unreal does not exist and so can have no part in it. You are not the non-self. You are only the self. Inquire within, who am I? And realize this.
So, because the nature of the question seems like it's kind of renounce the world, labels it with disgust. But the Maharshi, is being direct. I mean, he doesn't address it in that way. Just is what is real.
He has presented the essence. One is going to turn away from that which is transitory. What better way to do that but knowledge of what is eternal? What better way to get beyond misery or suffering than by realizing the nature and source of happiness within? This next dialogue, number 352, has been given a subtitle entitled The Different Creeds. The I thought rises up as the subject and object. I alone being held, all else disappears. It is enough, but only to the competent few. The others argue, quite so. The world that exists in my sleep has existed before my birth and will exist after my death. Do not others see it? How can the world cease to be if my ego appears not? The genesis of the world and different schools of thought are meant to satisfy such people. The disciple then said, nevertheless, being only products of intellect, they cannot turn the mind inward. Sri Bhagavan replied, just for this reason the scriptures speak of in-turn look, one-pointed look, and so on. The self being always the self, why should only a dhira be illumined? Does it mean a man of courage? No. Dhi equals intellect, Ra equals watch, protection. So dhira is the one who always keeps the mind inward bent without letting it loose. The I thought rises up as the subject and the object. I alone being held, all else disappears. It is enough, but only to the competent few. The I thought rises up. It is the primal notion. It appears in the guise of subject and object, I and this. In what does it rise? From where? I alone being held, all else disappears. The eyeless true I holds itself. There is no differentiation here, no subject, no object, no ego, no world. It is enough that it is enough to bring about liberation or complete self-realization, but only to the competent few, those who see the value of it and who intensely desire to realize the self. Others argue, in other words, hearing such instruction, they think, the world exists in my sleep, has existed before my birth, and will exist after my death. Do not others see it? How can the world cease to be if my ego appears not? The genesis of the world and the different schools of thought are meant to satisfy such people. My birth, my death. Aren't such determined by misidentification with the body? If one was not misidentified with the body, could there be my birth, my death? Certainly a body is born and a body dies, but is that the reality? In order to comprehend how the entire world depends on I, and see the value of seeking the nature of that I, one has to have an inward-turned mind, a mind that ceases to believe in its own imagining is such an inward-turned mind. Nevertheless, the Shastras, the scriptures, are vast and very varied in content and have something for everyone. So for those who believe the world is an existent, self-existent, independent reality, and an enduring one at that, they can learn from the scriptures about a divine source of its genesis. They can learn about the power that rules it. They can learn about that into which it all dissolves. But that's not the place to stop. That's just to prompt the inward turning of the mind. So the disciples said to Sri Bhagavan, nevertheless, being only products of intellect, these explanations of the genesis of the world, etc., are only products of the intellect. They cannot turn the mind inward. Sri Bhagavan replied, just for this reason the scriptures speak of in-turn look, one-pointed look, and so on. In other words, they do not stop with such explanations, but go on to say you must turn your mind inward. What does it mean to turn your mind inward? Truly speaking, it is to abandon the objectifying look, the objectifying tendency. What does it mean to turn the mind inward? To deeply inquire, who am I? The meaning of within is I. Who am I? Finally, he concluded with the self being always the self. The self never becomes other than what it is. Why should only a dhira be illumined? Dhira means man of courage. It also can have a meaning of pertaining to the intellect. And Sri Bhagavan explains, does it mean a man of courage? No. Intellect, watch, dhira, protection. So dhira is the one who always keeps the mind inward bent without letting it loose. one who keeps his mind always inward turned without letting it loose, that is, without setting it in the direction of ignorance, he is fit for self-realization. Be this way and realize the ever real. What is revealed within you is actually ever revealed. Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ram.